All right. All right. Looks like we're live again. It's Christmas Eve, Saturday afternoon. Just got back from grocery shopping and picking up a few Christmas cheers. This is a marijuana infused drink. It's not alcohol, no alcohol whatsoever. I've got my pal Rio. I can't quite see him there. He's on the floor, but I got my pal River there in the background. Today I'm going to bash on with another chapter from Kevin Weeks' book, The Untold Story of His Life Inside the Irish Mob, Whitey Bulger. So I'm on chapter 4 right now, page 77, if anybody's following along. That'd be fun, man. Chapter 4, Learning the Business, Loan Sharking, Extortion, and Murder. Once I started working with Jimmy full-time in 1982, the year I left T, I had a much closer view of his criminal activities. He would confide about them more openly and dealt more frequently with people in his circle in front of me. Although I rarely dealt personally with any of these bookmakers, as all those business deals had been established before I came on board. Jimmy included me in most of these meetings. For instance, I was now included in sit-downs with bookmakers who were arguing about money owed or paid out, or complaining about certain customers not paying, or complaining about their own payments to Jimmy and Stevie. I was also present at meetings with only loan sharks or those who owed debts. While most of those sit-downs or meetings took place in Triple O's or later at the variety store or liquor store that Jimmy owned, some were inside clubs, restaurants, or bars. Although there were some people to whom I was introduced, often I wasn't introduced at all and just stood there and listened. If the people had no idea who I was, they'd just glance nervously at me, most likely wondering what I was all about. Inevitably, I would create a chilling effect as I watched and listened and didn't say a word. The first and only time I met Chico Krantz, who ran a bookmaking operation, was at an afternoon meeting in Triple O's. Chico was in his late 40s or early 50s, kind of a big guy, with a mustache and a bald head with hair on each side. Always covered with a Stetson hat with a wide brim. At his meeting, there seemed to be a problem concerning the amount of money Chico was receiving and what he was paying to Jimmy and Stevie. There were about 20 people in the bar, none of whom noticed the three of them sitting quietly at a table. Jimmy and Stevie did all the talking, and I stood off to the side. It took no more than 15 minutes before Chico agreed to pay them around $90,000 more. The meeting never got heated, and all three of them remained calm. After the meeting was over, Chico stood up, they all shook hands, and he left. When I first went to work at Triple O's, I had begun my own loan sharking business. It was a simple business. I had taken whatever money I made and turned it over, increasing it little by little by lending it to people who paid it back at a certain rate, between 2 and 5 points a week. See, it wasn't rocket scientists. I simply decided my own rates and loaned to people, mostly my age or a little bit older, who I had known over the years. It was quick. it was a quick loan for people who couldn't go or didn't want to go to a bank. People who had jobs or who I knew could come up with the money they owed me. Someone would come up and say, Kev, I need $500. I'd give it to them and say, here you go. You pay me 25 a week on interest for the 500. That was the juice that didn't come off the principal. When I began, I had from 20 to 25 customers, and I lent from 100 up to $25,000 with interest from 2.5 points to 5 points. If someone's borrowing 25,000 at 2.5 points, they'd have to pay me $625 a week interest, which I collected weekly. Sure, they paid more interest than at a bank where they paid a maximum of 25 or 21% a year on a credit card. With me, it was up to 260% a year or 5 points a week, while a bank could only do 21% a year or 1.5 a month. But my customers needed cash quickly with no questions asked, and that was exactly what I provided, albeit at exorbitant rates. Since I knew everybody I dealt with, there was no need for me to keep detailed records on every loan I made. I'd keep the smaller ones in my head and just write the larger ones down for my records. Now that I was with Jimmy, I was loan sharking at the variety store and the liquor store, as well as at Triple O's and the L Street Tavern, and my reputation grew even stronger. When I told Jimmy I was going to continue to do it, he had no problem. Fine, just be careful, he told me. As my business expanded, I had 150 to 200,000 on the street. Still not a large business, but a comfortable one. My base continued to grow as customers would introduce me to other people who needed money. I rarely said no to the criminals who I knew who make money. There was no violence involved in my loan sharking business because most people paid it back. If they didn't pay it back on time, they'd tell me a story, and I'd say, don't worry about it. You'll pay me back when you get on your feet. The only loan sharking customer I ever had a problem with was Jimmy Santry, and it didn't involve the money I had loaned him. One night in front of people in the bar, he told me to go fuck myself, so I knocked him out. That has always been a good reason for me to fight. Always has been, always will be. Spending more time with Jimmy Bulger, however, I got to see that his personal habits were pretty simple. Unlike me, he didn't care for sports. He considered professional sports prolonged adolescence and felt they perverted people from moving forward with their lives. Not just professionally played sports were not only a waste of time, but were dangerous. For instance, if you were playing a pickup basketball game, you might get injured and miss work. You were better off, he'd tell me, reading a book than playing a game of ball. Working out and keeping yourself in shape was different. That you did for yourself, and there were less chances of getting hurt. And he certainly didn't approve of the paintball games I enjoyed at the tournaments, or the tournaments I went to 4 or 5 times a year, nor did he support my interest in karate. I was in my mid-30s when I started taking karate lessons with Pat Nee, a friend of mine at the Boston Athletic Club. Pat and I had only been taking the classes for 2 weeks when we heard about an upcoming tournament for the New England Championships. As it turned out, none of the black or brown belts who had been taking lessons for years at the karate school wanted to enter the tournament and represent the school. So Pat and I went to the instructor, Clarence Wilder, and told him we would fight in the tournament. Clarence, who was a fifth degree black belt, felt that we were too inexperienced and that it wasn't a good idea for us to go. But after Pat and I assured him we could take care of ourselves, Pat, Clarence, and I headed to the tournament at the Walter Brown Arena at Boston University. Students from karate schools all over New England were there, with 9 rings set up for fights scheduled in every ring. In my first tournament fight, when the signal was given to start, my opponent sucker me with a right hand. They stopped the fight and gave me a warning for illegal contact. I went back to the corner and told Pat and Clarence no one was suckering me and that I was going to knock this kid out. Pat called over a couple of black belts he knew and told them Kevin was mad. You better watch this fight. When the fight resumed and they gave the signal to start, I hit the kid a left hook and knocked him out with one shot. But because he had hit me illegally first, and then I had hit him illegally, he could no longer continue. As a result, I was allowed to go on to the next round of fights. Pat won his first fight, though legally. In my second fight, because of all my years of boxing, I had the advantage with my hands. So when my opponent threw a roundhouse kick, I stepped inside and hit him hard, or hit him a right hand to the ribs, breaking his ribs. When he couldn't continue, I went on to the next round. In Pat's second fight, he won a close decision, so the two of us continued on to the third round. In my third fight, in the quarterfinals, I hit my opponent in the chest and knocked the wind out of him. He went right down. When he continued in the when he couldn't continue in the time allotted, they stopped the fight and I got a warning, but was allowed to go on to the next round. Pat won his third fight easily. In the semifinals, my opponent jumped up in the air to deliver a kick to the head. I stepped inside to hit him a body shot underneath his heart, but when he came down, he landed on his feet and went down lower than I expected. I caught him square on the jaw, knocking him out, and was disqualified from the tournament. They said I was being malicious and intentionally trying to cause bodily harm. In all 4 of my fights, my opponents had gotten hurt. It wasn't that I was trying to hurt them. I just knew I couldn't compete with them with their feet, and they couldn't compete with me with my hands. So when I hit them, I tried to hurt them. Pat got outpointed in his fourth fight, so we were both out of the tournament. But since we had only been taking karate for 2 weeks and had made it into the semifinals, we felt we had made a good showing. The fellow I had fought in my last fight went on to win the division and was given a 6-foot trophy. When the tournament was over, I told him, that's my trophy. He didn't say anything to me, but just walked away. A month later, Pat and I fought in a tournament at UMass Boston, where we took first and second place. In a third tournament on South Shore, we did equally well. We were throwing some kicks in the fights, but mostly we were using our hands. We continued taking classes at the BAC for about a year. They also had a couple they also had an open night of sparring every Thursday night, so we could go down to spar. It was something different for us, and I enjoyed the exercise and the workout. But a lot of Boston police were coming down to the BAC to work out, and were getting a good look at us. Jimmy didn't like the fact that I was down there with the cops, so finally I stopped going. He always used to say to me, "You know what beats a black belt? A gun belt." Jimmy couldn't tell you a thing about baseball or football, but once the daughter of Teresa Stanley, his longtime girlfriend, married Montreal Canadiens hockey player Chris Nyland, he took an interest in the Montreal games. Even though he's wearing a Red Sox cap in the only photograph of us together, he had no special feeling for the team. In the summertime, when the sun was out, he'd put a hat on, but couldn't care less what emblem was stuck on it. The only sport he ever watched were the fights, and I got a kick out of seeing him once up to my folks' house to watch them with my father. He usually came over when there was a little or a title fight on. Jimmy looked far younger than my father, who was only 7 years older than him. But my dad had a bad heart attack and poor health and always looked older than he was. Even though Jimmy avoided funerals and wakes, when my father died of a heart attack at the age of 67 on June 17th, 1989, he paid for the funeral. While Jimmy avoided big crowds and never tried to draw attention to himself, he was actually aware of what was going on around us, both in Boston and in the world. He didn't watch much TV, but he did catch news or a good movie and liked the History Channel. Every night at midnight, the two of us would drive over to Store 24 on West Broadway and grab the first editions of the next day's two Boston newspapers. Then we'd pull into the parking lot next to Southie Savings Bank to read them, passing them back and forth. First, Jimmy would read the Metro section of the Globe and then the crime section of the Herald, commenting aloud on anything referring to our business or associates. Most often he would pick out an inaccuracy in one of the articles, saying the reporter or the law enforcement officer quoted didn't know what he was talking about. The Boston press is not known for its accuracy, he would tell me, and they never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But he felt that it was a good thing for us that none of these people knew what they were talking about, since that meant they had no idea what they were looking for in their investigation. It's like reading fairy tales, he would say, instead of solid newspaper reporting. But mostly he would read books. When he had been in prison, he'd read a lot of history and psychology books. Although he rarely talked about prison, he did discuss the LSD program he'd been a part of in Atlanta, blaming his frequent insomnia and nightmares on that useless, torturous experiment he'd taken part in during the late 1950s and early 1960s to lessen his prison sentence. That's interesting. I didn't know that he was a part of an LSD program. Crazy. In the 1950s and 60s to lessen his program. He'd been one of 8 inmates in the MK Ultra. See, this is real, man. MK Ultra program under Dr. Cecil Pfeiffer, Dr. Cecil, Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, a program that the public knew little about at the time, funded by Coca-Cola. Wow, I didn't know that either. Funded by Coca-Cola. The program had supposedly been created to find a cure for schizophrenia, but in actuality, it was run by the CIA, which was looking for a truth serum. Yeah. Jimmy told me that for 18 months he was either injected with LSD or given it as liquid. He said it made him crazy and unable to stand the thought of a needle ever again piercing his skin. It was also the reason he never got a good night's sleep and still woke up screaming in the middle of the night and frequently suffered hallucinations. He had no idea exactly what the LSD had done to his brain, but its after effects stayed with him long after his last shot. He'd been sent to jail in 1956 with a 20-year sentence and ended up doing 9 rather than the 12 that he most likely would have served without participation in that experiment. Not sure if it was worth it. I'm also not sure if Dr. Pfeiffer ever cured one schizophrenic or if the CIA got its truth serum. But I do know that out of the 18 prisoners who took part in the experiment in Atlanta, in the hope of shaving a few years off their sentences, some went stark raving mad and some even committed suicide. Jimmy had been a pretty violent guy when he had gone into prison at age 26, so it would be hard to determine just how much more vicious he became as a result of the LSD. Besides the nightmares and insomnia and hallucinations, and maybe a shade more violence in his system, Jimmy left prison with an insatiable hunger for knowledge. He rarely passed a bookstore without going in to check out the latest books, usually buying at least one each time. He especially liked true crime, World War II, and history books on the Vietnam War. Some of his favorites were the Tunnels of Cu Chi about the Vietnam War and Murder Machine, a true story of murder, madness, and mayhem. An interesting book about Roy DeMeo. I should read that one. And New Jersey, New York criminal. He'd read the true crime books carefully, often at night when he couldn't sleep, looking to find some insight into police operations. Anything that he could would give him an edge in his constant attempt to keep one up on the law. He'd made special note of the change of the techniques of bugging operations, as well as the specific equipment criminals might use. In the past, he'd been in touch with other high-powered criminals such as Mickey Spillane and Tommy Devaney from the Westies, from New York's Hell's Kitchen, who'd come up to Boston to help him out years earlier during the South Boston gang wars. He'd often hand a book over to me, telling me that what he'd found worthwhile in it, or insist on buying me a copy at the bookstore. An avid reader myself, some I liked, and some didn't hold my interest. Our discussions about current affairs were never one-dimensional. We'd talk about politics, particularly the Kennedys, all of whom he despised because of their busing stance. Since his brother Billy was such an influential politician and president of the Massachusetts State Senate, Jimmy stayed away from politics, anxious not to shed light on any connection between the two of them. Jimmy and I often discussed history, education, and business, even legitimate business like our own investments in the stock market. We both made some money when someone told us RYKA, a Massachusetts woman's sneaker company that was later absorbed by another company, would be a good investment. We often talked about how much time and effort we put into being criminals as well as into not getting caught. We discussed how if we had legitimate jobs, we would have more money with the same amount of time and effort, and we would have enjoyed the money so much more. We even talked about the possibility of getting into a legitimate business, but it was too late in our lives for that. We were too well known by law enforcement to make such a change. It's important to understand that our relationship was not just focused on crime. Yeah, it took up most of our time, but there were lots of stretches when we weren't doing stuff and we're simply sitting around. Some of those times was we sat around and laughed and joked and had a good time. But many of those days we were just downright boring. We'd go for a walk around town for some exercise, but also let our presence be known. We also had to look formidable, never meek. We worked out and kept in shape. We let certain people have a look at Jimmy, and I know that, and know that he was around. Many times, the only thing we do during an entire day and night we would be to pick up some envelopes containing rent and stuff, keeping ourselves busy for no more than an hour. The rest of the time, we just keep our eyes out for what was happening around us, and our cars turned into what people were saying, or our ears tuned into what people were saying and who was doing what. But then when something happened, it was adrenaline time and a relief not to be bored any longer. But there was always plenty of time to talk and about the many topics that interested Jimmy and how they affected legitimate people, like unemployment. Jimmy was cornered with social injustice, especially with what busing was doing to the people of South Boston. Nothing got him more aggravated. Even though I was 24 and he was 51, when we began to work together or closely together, our relationship never seemed like father son, boss employee. From the earliest years, I felt we were associates. We would exchange ideas and more times than not thought alike. He was surprisingly open minded, listening to people for 4 to 5 hours at a time, considering it well worth his time. If he gleaned one bit of information or one piece of knowledge from that conversation, usually filing it away or learning more about it. Fuck, man. It wouldn't necessarily be information having to do with crime. We could be sitting on a bench and he would turn to a person sitting nearby and strike up a conversation, curious as to where the guy came from and what he did, generally interested in him, and not just so he could relieve the guy of his money. This made him different from most criminals who were the one-dimensional, thinking about nothing but crime. Sure, he was all the things people said he was: a killer, fierce, forceful, dangerous, but he was also fair, respectful to people and their opinions, treating most of them courteously. If someone was right or had a valid point or opinion, he gave them credit for their attitude. Sometimes he did things that I didn't understand, but I knew he had his reasons, and I would never question them. I never tried to figure out why he didn't like certain people or question his opinions. Again, I figured he had his reasons. I also knew, he'd never ask me to do anything that he wouldn't do himself, and I was never afraid to do anything he asked, no matter what it was. I learned early on how things could change rapidly with Jimmy, how a person could say the wrong thing and his whole uh, standing would change. I was also I was also surprised to learn that, unlike Stevie, Jimmy considered violence the last step, but once he made up his mind to use it, that was it. If you put him to that point, there would be no taking, there would be no talking. So, someone was going to be badly hurt or murdered. One of these, one of the first things Jimmy taught me was to consider the long range ramifications of whatever we did. The idea of committing a crime was to get away with it. He wasn't considered about, or he wasn't interested about the next 6 months, but rather the with things are, but rather with how things would work out years down the road. There were lots of scores we would pass on because the percentages weren't there. Sure, we could take the person down, but Jimmy always thought about what that action would mean later on. What might that what might this person do in a few years? What kind of life did he lead? If he got pinched and needed an out, what could he give up or give us up, or would he give us up? Jesus. Every extortion, every dealing, every action, large or small, was carefully thought of or thought out far beyond the present moment. One of the scores we passed on was a home invasion involving a vault with $30 million in it. It was brought to us by another fellow who I had little doubt would be looking to give us up if anything went wrong. I was also worried that there would be a lot of heat and we would be the fall guys. Jimmy and I talked about it for a week or so and finally scrapped the plans. No one else took the job, and neither of us ever regretted our decision. Most of the times we worked with a regular schedule, but the hours could be long. Because of his nightmares and insomnia, Jimmy was not an early riser and rarely came in before 3:30. Then we'd take care of business, loan sharking, shakedowns of drug dealers, accepting money that was dropped off, collecting other money owed, and all the illegal activities, plus running the stores and bar we're involved with. In addition to the furniture appliance store that I owned with Kevin O'Neill and the Courts Inn bar that Jimmy and I bought, Jimmy, Steve Fleming, and I bought a liquor store in South Boston in 1983 at the Rotary Variety Store, and the building that housed and the building that housed it at 309 Old Colony Avenue. A year later, at the beginning, I would come down to one of the stores at 8 in the morning to take care of what needed to be done. Later, I started coming in around noon and stayed till 5. After his rounds, Jimmy would actually go to Teresa's for dinner. Then around 9, he'd call me and tell me where to meet him. He had code names for each of the stores, which was usually where I would meet him. Hop into his car and drive somewhere. Staying out till midnight or later. Sometimes we worked on Sundays too, but mostly it was a 6 day a week job so that he could spend Sunday with Teresa and her family and the evening with Kathy. Nice. His girlfriend, wife, the whole bit. And I got and I could spend some time with Pam and the kids. What I ask is, when do they find time for reading? Jimmy always in jail, I guess. Jimmy always turned into the weather reports, making sure we use the bad weather to commit certain crimes. Since most people stay in when the weather is bad, the only people out usually have their heads down or are carrying umbrellas and not paying attention. All they want to do is get where they're going quickly. If we had to do some criminal activities like moving guns, hurting someone, or meeting someone without being followed, Jimmy would check the weather forecast and plan accordingly. Since these plans always worked better when it was raining or snowing. Many nights after midnight, when bars were closed and only crooks or cops were out, we'd pack it in and go home, rather than draw attention to ourselves at that hour. During a typical day, we'd put in around 6 hours, but if something was going on, it would be longer. But I was more than well paid for the time I spent working with Jimmy. Working at Triple O's and at the MBTA, I had been making around 800 a week clear. Once I had been working with Jimmy for a year or two, I was making thousands a week, and that didn't include scores from shakedowns and extortion that would bring in additional lump sums. As the years went on, I figured I made between 5 and 7 million, while Jimmy pulled in at least 30 to 50 million. Wow. Okay, as the years went on, I figure I made between 5 and 7 million, while Jimmy pulled in, it doesn't say at least, it says at least 30 to 50 million. Wow. With a lot more money to be enjoyed, I had no trouble finding ways to spend that. Okay. Like buying new cars in '79, I was driving a blue Audi Fox, but I got rid of that and bought a 1980 Thunderbird. After that, every year I bought a new car, a Lincoln, a Cadillac, or a Pontiac, whatever I wanted. Even though I spent my money on clothes and jewelry, I didn't do much traveling, preferring to take a vacation to play paintball. Jimmy was never happy when I went to a tournament all over the country or to the Caribbean. He he wanted that I was not thinking about business or would get hurt. But I won many of these tournaments and found them relaxing, exciting, and competitive, as well as a chance to meet interesting people and get a good workout. Jimmy and Stevie uh, took vacations together, traveling to Europe or to Florida with different girls. I never traveled with them, but it was a vacation for me when Jimmy was away. Then I could take care of what had to be done and wouldn't have to head out every night. It was a chance to relax and not be on 24-hour alert for business concerns. Jimmy's health was pretty good, but he did have an occasional attack of arrhythmia. When I went with him to see his doctor in Massachusetts General, Dr. Paco said it was nothing to worry about, that he was just experiencing a little stress. His advice to Jimmy was to simply simplify his life. So Jimmy cut down from 4 major women in his life to just 2, Teresa and Kathy. That's funny. We both agreed that the most stress in a man's life came from a woman, that's for sure, who create more stress than complicated and danger-filled business deals. All the stuff and rumors that questioned Jimmy's sexuality were lies spread by the media. He had more women than Hugh Hefner. Guys like Donald Trump weren't even in his league. Donald Trump, that's funny. Whenever we went out to the bars and clubs, women of all ages were all over him, were, were after him. Variety is the spice of life, he'd say, as he enjoyed all of them. But nothing was more important to Jimmy than business, and he never ceased to ponder all aspects of it. He spent a lot of time teaching me how to deal with the people in our business, stressing the importance of never letting them be a bad with them with a bad feeling and never socializing with them, leaving them with a bad feeling. He'd tell me always to remember that we were not dealing with regular people, that we couldn't be nice to the people we did business with. They were criminals. When you're dealing with the regular people, you're nice to them. They're not nice to you. Well, there were some criminals who might be regular, normal people who happened to be involved in criminal activity. You had to remember that they too were criminals. No one, no one is happy about paying you, he told me. Don't ever think that they're your friend. Some of these people don't understand anything. You can't reason with them. Then you have no choice but to use violence to make them understand. He had his own unique way of dealing with people when things went wrong. It was fascinating to watch how he could come down on someone, reduce him to the ground verbally, putting him in his place and degrading him completely. But then he would slowly bring the guy back up. So ultimately the guy left with good with a good feeling, understanding exactly what he had to do to improve himself, how he had to work hard, save money, and stay away from drugs and gambling. But there were some people Jimmy simply didn't like at all, and those people were rightfully afraid of him. As a criminal, he made a point of openly preying on criminals and opposed to legitimate people. And when things couldn't be worked out to his satisfaction with those people, after all, jeez, I'm just stumbling over these words. After all, the other options had been explored, he wouldn't hesitate to use violence. Certainly, if he thought there was a chance of this person coming back to cause him some harm, there was no sense in bothering to give him a beating. He might as well fucking kill him, and he did. Tommy King in 1975 was one example. Although it was Although I was 19 at the time and not yet working for Jimmy, he told me the whole story. Tommy's problem began when he and Jimmy had words at Triple O's. Who was a Mullins, made a fist, and Jimmy saw it. The next day, Tommy went to the old harbor projects where Jimmy was living with his mother and tried to make amends. He said he had been drunk and hadn't meant anything he had said the night before. Jimmy told him, "Don't worry about it, forget it." A week later, Tommy was dead. Tommy's second and last mistake had been getting into the car with Jimmy, Stevie, and John Martorano. That night, Jimmy put Tommy in the passenger seat with Stevie and Johnny in the back seat and told them that we were going to look, that they were looking for someone to kill. That someone, of course, was Tommy. As they were driving around, Tommy hanged a banged on his supposedly bulletproof flak jacket and joked, "If we don't find him, we can try this out." The minute he finished that joke, Johnny shot him in the head from the back seat. The bullet went right through his head, splattered blood and brains all over the place. But Jimmy just reached over, propped Tommy up, and put a baseball cap on his bloodied head. A minute later, Johnny said he had to make a phone call and asked Jimmy to pull over to Dunkin' Donuts in Quincy. He was gone for a few minutes, supposedly to make a bet, then got back in the car and the four of them drove off. Jimmy drove around for a few more minutes and then found a spot at the Neponset River where they buried Tommy. Later that same night, Jimmy killed Buddy Leonard and left him in Tommy's car on Pilsudski Way in the old colony projects to confuse the authorities. Tommy, a raw-boned, 6'4" rough guy, had been a perfect example of a loose cannon. Jimmy knew that Tommy was someone who couldn't be controlled, so he might as well kill him and get it over with. Although Jimmy always said, "Act in haste, repent at leisure." Once his mind was made up, that was it. There was no sense in trying to get him to change his mind. As it turned out, the night King and Leonard were killed, there was supposed to be a third victim, Billy Gallant, but he didn't show up. I'm not sure exactly why Jimmy intended to kill Gallant. I think he just didn't like him. I fear a few years late after that night, Jimmy and I were driving up Dorchester Avenue when we saw Billy walking alone. It was raining out, so Jimmy pulled over and said, "Billy, come here. Give me a ride." I hopped into the back, but Billy just leaned into the passenger door and said, "Whitey, no offense, but people get in the car and they never get out. Thanks anyhow, but I'd rather walk." Jimmy nodded. I jumped back into the front seat and we drove away. Jimmy started laughing, looked at me and said, "Smart guy." There was no doubt he would have killed Billy that night. As it turned out, Billy died of pneumonia a few years later. Maybe he got a cold that night, or that rainy night. It didn't take me long to grasp Jimmy's reaction to people by his facial expressions. Even though he wore sunglasses a lot, when I could see his eyes, I read them perfectly. And who was going to stop him then? Okay, nobody nobody. I certainly wasn't going to put myself between him and some asshole who deserved what he was going to get. It was rarely necessary for Jimmy to tell me to hit someone who was bothering him. He could just see that he was getting madder. Then someone would say something smart and I would just crack him. There were times, of course, when Jimmy would get mad at me. Sometimes he'd yell or be cold. Those times I'd give him his time, and when he was ready, usually a few hours later, he'd come looking for me, and we'd talk about what had gotten him so upset. One thing that did bother him was if I was out drinking, which I didn't do very often. He always worried that when we drank in local bars, I might get into a fight there, and if I did, the outcome would never be good. You're not being fair, he always told me. If someone has a fight with you and you beat them up, you could do some serious damage, even kill the person. Yet if by some chance he beats you, he thinks it's over, but it's not the end of it. You're not through. Yeah. you're going to want to go back and kill him. And he was right. When I was younger, it hadn't been different. It had been different. I could have survived losing a fight, but as I got older, I couldn't live with the idea of someone walking the streets saying they beat me. I'd just have to kill him. At the very least, I'd have to hurt them badly to make an example. I could never afford to let them win. I was never the toughest guy out there, but I was of a different mindset than other guys. I couldn't handle not beating them. I certainly wasn't worried about someone coming after me after I beat them. I knew I could handle myself no matter what came my way. But if someone beat me, I would bide my time. Whether it took 6 months or a year, I would wait for a talk to die. I would wait for the talk to die down and the person to think that I didn't or he didn't have a problem, and then I would go after him. And Jimmy was just like that, just like me. He too couldn't live with being beat. If someone ever did anything to him, we'd be out every day and every night hunting him down. Neither one of us could afford to be beaten. We made a living being feared. If one person beat us, then he would have made it easier for the next person to come after us. So we take care of the person any way we could. Any way we could. I did have guys shoot at me, but I always carried a pistol for which I had a permit and quickly shot back. At the time when Chucka Devin's brother Franny got shot and some kid pulled a knife on me, to be truthful, I hadn't been thinking about trying not to kill that kid. I hadn't cared one way or another. To me, it was just a fight. There was no doubt I had hurt a lot of people, but when you're hurting people that often, it doesn't affect you. You don't enjoy it. You just get into it. I figure I must have had over 500 fights in my lifetime, just working at Triple O's 4 nights a week with at least one fight a night. Over a period of a year, I'd easily have 200 fights. I I had too many fights, but with each one, I always wanted to hit hard and get it over with as soon as possible. The last thing I wanted to was to end up wrestling in the street and looking bad. Still, I always believed that when I came to a street or bar fight, there was no such thing as a winner. We were all losers. Even if someone wins the fight and is a winner in the eyes of the others, he still pays a price, both physically and well as mentally. In 9 out of 10 of my fight, in 9 out of 10 of my fights, the person I fought was hurt badly. And when it was over, I was always mad at him, thinking, "You made me do this to you." In professional sports like boxing, the fighters aren't mad at one another. It's a professional fight. But in the street, even when you win, a little bit of you is hurt. And chances are you've made an enemy as well. Not even a like today. Talk about brutal, eh? Well, despite Jimmy's concerns about how hard I hit, we went to whatever clubs we wanted. We never expected a problem. We never looked for a problem, but we never walked away from a problem. And if it wasn't handled that night, be it would be handled later, but on our terms. The outcome was never good for the other person. Neither Jimmy nor I drank much, but there were times when I might drink a bit more than he thought safe. And even if he wasn't with me when that happens, somehow he managed to keep tabs on me. One afternoon, I was with a friend Brian Lee having a good time in Faneuil Hall, bar owned by Sean Driscoll. Around 9 that night, Sean came over to tell me that I had a phone call and I could take it in his office. It was Jimmy on the phone asking, "What are you doing?" he asked. I could tell he was upset. "Having a few beers," I told him. "Meet me in 15 minutes," he told me. And that was the end of my drinking. I left right away and drove over to South Boston, grateful that I wasn't drunk. I have no idea how he found out where I was. Maybe one of the owners wanted to get me out of the place before anything happened. One thing Jimmy did not tolerate was drug use among his associates. It made them too unpredictable. Nick Femia, who was hooked on cocaine, was an example of what happened when that rule was ignored. After Jimmy pushed Femia out of the business, Femia got killed trying to shake down a kid, robbing him of his coke. After I'd been with him a year or so, Jimmy told me that I was the smartest guy he'd ever met. I think he meant that I considered everything carefully, thinking over all aspects of a situation before I acted. Not that he had any fools around him, but what he did have around him were a lot of tough guys. But he wasn't interested in just tough guys. He wanted smart guys, smart tough guys. Over and over, he explained to me how we were all hostage to one another, how everything one of us did reflected on everyone else. I understood exactly what he was saying, and I knew that whatever he asked me to do, I would do. If we killed somebody and the police came upon us, we were prepared to handle the situation. We would have shot it. We would have shot it out with them. I would have seen. I wouldn't have seen that. I wouldn't say that we were armed to the teeth, but we always had arms available: assault rifles, hand grenades, whatever we might possibly need. More arms than or that we could possibly use in a lifetime. Some we'd bought in New York, and some Jimmy had went back to the late 60s. Unlike me, most of the people around Jimmy went back years and years, but like me, most of these men were extremely violent men. I thought of the people surrounding Jimmy as being in three tiers. In the inner core were Jimmy, Stevie, myself, and two other people who were out on the street at the time. Both of them will remain unnamed, who went back to the 60s with Jimmy. The second group was composed of men also violent, close friends of ours and involved with us, but not around us all the time. And the third tier included men who were not violent but were money makers who worked for us, like the bookmakers, drug dealers, and the people involved in illegal activities like card games or Vegas nights. Jimmy paid special attention to this important third group. If any of them were out drinking and had a problem that night, it quickly became our problem. To be specific, a problem is in our pockets. The fact that those guys were giving us money monthly or weekly meant that we have to go out collectively and straighten out their problems. Another reason for why Jimmy never liked people with bad habits to work for him. But Jimmy also kept an eye on what was going on around in the neighborhood, even on people who had nothing to do with us. One summer night, while the two of us were driving on the East 8th Street in Covington by the old German club, we saw two Southie brothers, Frankie and Kevin McDonald, fighting, really going at it. Jimmy got out of the car and told Frankie's three friends who were watching the fist fight, Ricky Marnick, Paul Moore, and another guy named Kevin McDonald, who were called Andre's, who we called Andre the Giant, to break it up. Don't let them fight, he told the guys. They're brothers. After Frankie's friends grabbed the two guys and broke up the fight, Jimmy ordered Kevin into the car while Frankie took off with his three friends. Kevin, 7 years younger than me, was a nice kid I'd known as for a long time, while Frankie, who was a few years older than Kevin, was a talented boxer and a tough kid. His body was like that of a Greek god, in tremendous shape from always working out hard. Jimmy and I drove around with Kevin for a while. He's your brother, Jimmy said to Kevin as we drove off. It doesn't look good for people to see you like that. But Kevin told us Frankie was going on a score the next day and he didn't want him to go. That he had a bad feeling about the score. We dropped Kevin off at his house, and sure enough, the next day, Frankie got shot during a Wells Fargo armored car robbery in Medford. The bullet went under his arm, where there was no cover from the bulletproof vest he was wearing, traveling through his lungs and ripping his aorta. Because he was in such tremendous shape, Frankie was able to run to the getaway car with a bag of money before collapsing in the back seat. Afterward, some people accused his friends of leaving him on the score, but the truth was he bled to death in a matter of minutes. Even if they had gotten him to the hospital. There were no way they could stop the bleeding. Frankie died on July 17th, 1984 at age 25. It was a terrible shame. I went to the wake, which was painfully sad. Jimmy didn't believe in wakes and didn't attend. His feeling was that if a person died, that was it, and there were no reasons to have a wake or a funeral. When Jimmy's mother died on January 1st, 1980, Jimmy didn't go to the funeral, knowing it would bring a lot of publicity to the family, especially to Billy. But he did go to the funeral after it had closed so he could see her when no one was there. But riding around with Jimmy at night, I never knew what could happen from one moment to the next. One particular night, Jimmy and I were in his Ford LTD when another car began to jockey for position with us on the Morrissey Boulevard. It went on for a few minutes until we stopped at a set of lights. The other car pulled up beside us, and the two guys in the car gave Jimmy and me the finger and began swearing at us. Jimmy started to get out of his car, but I jumped out first, went to the passenger window where the guy was still giving me the finger, and put my fist through the window. After I hit the guy in the face, I got back in our car and Jimmy drove off. My hand was bleeding, and when I went to wipe off the blood, I noticed that a little piece of 3-carat diamond ring I wore on my pinky finger had sheared off. I wasn't sure if the diamond had a flaw or what, but one of the corners of that ring was gone. Jimmy took a look at it when we pulled up to Teresa's house, and then I drove the car back to my house. A couple hours later, after dinner, when I came back to Teresa's to pick up Jimmy for the evening, he handed me a new ring. Here you go, he said, as he gave me a solitaire 5-carat diamond pinky ring. Thanks, I said, and removed the old ring and put the new one on. It was the only time he had ever given me jewelry, and it was beautiful, worth, I was certain, over $100,000. I knew that Jimmy bought most of his jewelry from a particular jeweler in the jeweler's building on Washington Street in Boston, and that he also bought hot stuff. On his own hand, he wore a 5-carat solitaire pinky ring. Around his neck, he wore a gold Christ head medallion and on a chain, and on his wrist was a gold Patrick Phillip watch given to him by the guys at the Winter Hill. In addition, on his left pinky, he wore a 4-carat Irish claddagh ring with 2 hands holding a heart, a ring he had made after he'd seen my 3-carat claddagh ring. Jimmy had a great taste in jewelry and was generous with gifts to the women. I wonder how many. Oh yeah, you're almost there. Okay, it won't be long now. To the women in his life, buying diamond earrings and diamond cocktail rings and watches for Teresa and Kathy, and expensive pieces of jewelry for the other girls he dated, as well as cars and condos for many of them. He never worried about the price of clothing he bought for himself. One day when we were shopping on Newberry Street, we went into the El Paso shoe store where they sold custom-made cowboy boots. He ended up paying $2,500 for a black alligator skin boots made specifically for his feet. These boots were made by Foley, who made only 55 pairs a year. He also bought a couple of pairs of boots, somewhere around $1,000 a pair. Another time, we went into the same store and I bought some beautiful ostrich skin custom-made cowboy boots, which cost around $1,700 and looked nice with a pair of dungarees. The salespeople at El Paso knew who James Bulger was and were unfailingly polite and helpful to him. Why not? He was courteous to all of them, and paid cash for everything he bought. The two of us shopped in the finest men's clothing stores on Newberry Street, like Daniel, Renee, and Louis, where we each bought custom tailored suits. I ended up with dozens of Louis suits in my closet, but I hardly wore any of them. But no matter how much money we made, we were always looking for new ways to make more. So I was pleased one night when the opportunity to make money for myself simply presented itself in front of me. I was in the variety store, standing by the counter, watching the place for Mark, the guy who owned the ticket concession in the store that sold tickets for concerts and sporting events, when a heavy-set customer came in and asked for him. When I said Mark would be back in a while, the customer told me he had to hurry up because he had to go see some bookmakers. If you need to place a bet, he told me slyly, come see me. You got a lot of guys working for you, I asked, all over Charleston, Southie, Dorchester. Really? Yeah. What's your name? Kevin Hayes. What's yours? Kevin Weeks. Oh, shit. You never know who you're talking to. Nice meeting you, I said, and left it at that. but now I had him on my radar. A short time later, I had a friend who knew Kevin Hayes arranged a meeting at the house of another friend who happened to be in prison. I had Hayes come down to the cell bar where I had stretched out a plastic tarp on the floor. As soon as Hayes walked in, I took out a pistol. You're going to pay me $100,000 for your football action, or I'm going to kill you, I told him. He started talking real crazy stuff that I couldn't hardly understand. All of a sudden, he yelled, "Do you think I'm wired?" and pulled off his shorts. The 400-pound gorilla stood there with no underwear, his little dick looking like he had a piece of bubble gum stuck to his bush. The last thing I had thought was that he would be wired, so I had no idea what he was doing. After some more of his crazy talk, he agreed to pay us $25,000 a few days later, and then $5,000 a month till he had paid the whole amount. We had the lunatic get dressed, and the person who had brought him drove him away. After a couple of years, he had only paid us $50,000, but he went out of business and got indicted for something he did while working for the Boston Election Commission in 1999. He gave me up as part of my indictment. Another great stand-up guy. But my extortions could never match Jimmy's, who was Machiavellian in the way that he was able to outthink other people. Eventually, everyone he extorted understood that he would either take them down or take their money. In every case, these guys made the decision to depart with their money rather than their lives. No one, it seemed, was willing to make an enemy out of us. Sometimes all you had to do Holy crap, eh? Sometimes all you had to do was threaten people with a physical beating, and they would pay you. But as with everything Jimmy did, violence was the last resort. Yet no matter what it took, it yet no matter what it took, we always managed to get what we wanted. Still, some people made look at that, eh? Hour and 12. No one watching. Not a single like. What a joke. Still, some people made things difficult for themselves. Like this one fellow who owed us 15 grand. We get him into the car and sat him in the back seat next to me while Jimmy and Stevie were in the front seat. The guy was complaining, giving Jimmy a tale of woe about how he didn't have the money to pay, how he had to put bets in and lost, how his daughter was getting married and he had no money for the wedding. At first, Jimmy and Stevie were talking nice, but when it become obvious that the guy thought it was all a game, Jimmy let him know it was for real. "Give me the money or I'll kill you," he told him. Still playing around like we were suckers, the guy said, "You'll be doing me a favor if you kill me." With that, I grabbed the guy and put his arms behind his back. Jimmy took out a pistol, leaned over the seat and put it to his head. "Now," the guy started screaming. "I'll give you the money. I'll get you the money." "Jimmy, when?" Let me go to my let me get into the house," he said. We were parked in front of his house. So He went in and came out with 50 grand in 20 minutes. When it came to extortion, Jimmy was anything but ordinary, often creating the problem and then solving it. Now, if a guy actually had a legitimate problem, such as someone trying to kill him, we would put ourselves between the two of them and make his problem our problem. Of course, the person in danger would have to pay us to do this. But many times the problem was not only not legitimate, it wasn't real. In those cases, we searched out someone who we knew had money, created a problem for him, and solved the problem for a large sum of money. For example, we would corner the guy coming out of work and inform him that someone had been paid to kill him. We would take turns. We would take turns speaking, but it didn't matter if it was Jimmy or me or Jimmy, Stevie, and me. The reaction was always the same. The person would be scared to death, but we'd calm him down quickly by telling him that if he paid us somewhere between 50 and 500,000, we would back the killer off. 10 out of 10 times the person would pay away, always coming to the conclusion that while he could make more money, he couldn't make another life, and this life was his most valuable commodity. If it was a large payment, we would put him on a payment plan with a certain amount of time to pay, and if we liked him, at the end we might even tell him to forget about the final payments. But if we didn't like him, we make it clear that this wasn't a bank where you have lots of different payment plans. Here there was only one payment plan. We wanted our money. One night, Jimmy and I went to the home of a drug dealer, rang his doorbell, and shook him down, telling him we had been paid to kill him. You sold drugs to a guy's grandchild, we said, and this guy's offered us $50,000 to kill you. Now you have the chance to pay us the same amount. We'll back this person off so he won't bother you. That dealer ended up paying $25,000 right away and then paid us the balance monthly, and ended up working for us from then on. There were, of course, some times when some people really did offer us money to kill someone. Then we would go to the potential victim and tell them we were being offered money to kill you. Every time that person paid us, we wouldn't. Another example of creating a problem and charging to solve charging to solve it involved a man who owned a bar in Dorchester. We heard he was having trouble with a guy around 30 who kept coming into his bar. One night, Jimmy, Stevie, and I drove by the owner's house with a couple of other guys and shot it up while he was standing by the window. We didn't try to kill him. We just wanted to scare him. In a few minutes, we blew out the windows and the doors. Then the next day, when the owner of the bar reached out to us, Jimmy and Stevie told him that the guy who was giving him trouble in the bar had tried to kill him, but he would straighten it out. Without hesitation, the bar owner handed us $25,000 to make the problem go away. In this case, the problem was us, not some customer at the bar, but the bar owner never saw that. Ray Slinger's extortion turned out to be the perfect example of the media publicizing a story that was totally different than the event I personally witnessed. Ray was a real estate and insurance agent in South Boston who had done business with Kevin O'Neill. One day around noon in 1986, Jimmy and I were upstairs in Triple O's eating the egg sandwiches and frappes we had just gotten from the deli next door. Fitzy, the bartender, called up to Kevin that Ray Slinger was downstairs. Even though Ray was a legitimate business, he didn't have a sterling business reputation. Unbeknownst to me, Stevie and Jimmy had already talked to Ray and told him they wanted to talk to him. When Jimmy heard Fitzy's message, he looked at Kevin O'Neill and said, "What's up with him?" "I want to talk to him about an insurance bill," Kevin said. "I gave him the money, but he kept it and didn't pay the bill." Jimmy said, "Tell him to come up." When Fitzy then reported that Ray was with a woman, Jimmy told him to tell Ray to come up by himself. A few minutes later, Ray, who was in his 50s, heavy-set, around 6'1", and with thin silver hair, walked into the room wearing a long tan trench coat, white shirt, black dress pants, and dark shoes. When he saw the three of us sitting at a table, he began to shake visibly. As he stood off to the side, his coat separated, I noticed a pistol tucked into his pants. Without a word, I jumped up over our table and, knocking him over, grabbed the pistol out of his pants. "Whoa, slow down," Jimmy said. But when I pulled out the pistol, he got mad. "You dirty motherfucker," he shouted at Ray. "You bring a pistol around us? Where did you get it?" "I borrowed it off a friend," he told Jimmy, "for protection." With the gun now in his hand, Jimmy told Ray to sit down. After that, despite the lies printed by the media, no one beat up Ray or punched him. All I had done was thrown him off his feet, making him bang off the wall. But the guy was hyperventilating as Jimmy put the gun to the top of his head, saying, "I could shoot you on the top of your head and there would be no blood." Ray started shaking uncontrollably, tears coming down his face as Jimmy continued. "Listen," he told Ray, "I've been offered $50,000 to kill you." "By who?" Slinger said. "It doesn't matter," Jimmy answered. "Unless you give me the money, I'll kill you." When Slinger said, "I can give you $2,000. I can give you $2,000, Jimmy." Jimmy kicked him in the shin with his cowboy boot. "My boots cost more than that," Jimmy said, and Slinger looked like he was going to have a heart attack. "Hey, calm down," Jimmy told him, and then told him to go downstairs and get him a beer. I had started to head downstairs when Slinger said, "No, I want a mixed drink." I went downstairs and got him a gin and tonic. He drank half of it down in one gulp. Then Jimmy said, "I'm going to talk to Ray," and Kevin and I went downstairs. 15 minutes later, he called the two of us back upstairs and told Kevin, "You're going to meet Ray on Friday and he'll give you an envelope. And then every other Friday, he'll meet you with an envelope until everything is straightened out." At this point, Ray was sweating and pale. As it turned out, Ray Slinger paid $25,000 of the $50,000 we charged him for not killing him. No one had offered money to kill Ray, but Jimmy was shaking him down because he didn't like the way Ray treated people in town. After the scene in Triple O's, Ray went to a local politician to try and get us to back off and stuff, but to no avail. Then he started talking around town and telling people what had happened at Triple O's. That, gee, where's a curse? That story got back to the FBI and subsequently got back to us. And Jimmy told Kevin O'Neill to tell Ray to forget about the rest of the money. When Ray was first approached by the FBI to tell them what had happened to him, he was hesitant. But then he gave them a story in which Jimmy had told me to get a body bag, not a beer. I know he heard exactly what Jimmy had said to me because he had asked me for a mixed drink instead of a beer. And I never heard of any bar in South Boston that had a body bag behind a bar, not even Triple O's back in those days. But after that conversation with the FBI, in which he had thrown in that body bag detail to make his story more dramatic, Ray understood that he could never come around us, that we never talk to him again, that we would never talk to him again. Whatever he said would be his word against ours. He had no proof of what we had said. If he ever got wired, we would have known and would have answered his questions with, "What are you? What are you crazy? Are you on drugs?" As it turns out, Jimmy had got what he wanted that afternoon, and Ray Slinger got his mixed drinks, not a body bag. One extortion concerned me personally. It was a case where I literally had the guy over the fence. After I bought a house in a Boston suburb, the bank came out to survey my property for insurance purposes and discovered that my neighbor, 30-foot long fence with 6 inches on my side, was on my side of the property line. When I told my neighbor it had to be moved, he went to a friend of his, developer named Richie Buccieri. The guy who sold me my house told me that Buccieri wanted him to backdate a bill of sale for the land the fence was on. The next thing I knew, I had Richie Buccieri meeting Jimmy and Stevie at Stevie's mother's house, where he was fined $200,000 for the lack of a better term, interfering. Since I ended up sitting outside in the car during the meeting, I got $50,000 for basically doing nothing. Nothing happened to the neighbor, but the developer had to pay $200,000 for 6 inches of fence. Another extortion involved Michael Solomondo, who turned out to be a stand-up guy. In 1982, after John Callahan, the accountant who was cooperating with the FBI in the Roger Wheeler World JLA murder, was killed, we extorted Solimondo, who had been Callahan's partner in the construction business. We had come down to Triple O's, where Jimmy, Stevie, and I were waiting for him upstairs in the function hall. Here we sat him on a stool in the little bar where Jimmy was holding a machine gun with a silencer under a towel on his lap, and I had a pistol tucked in my waistband, which he might or might not have seen. Jimmy started to talk to him about Callahan's offshore account in Switzerland, telling Mondo he wanted his money. "I know nothing about that," said Solomondo, who was a bodybuilder. Jimmy went on at about Jimmy went on and on about wanting his fucking money. Finally, Jimmy ripped the towel off his lap and stuck the machine gun into Solomondo's massive chest. "Your muscles aren't going to do you any good now," he told him. Give me your fucking money or I'm going to kill you." Mondo gave in right away, and within a day or two, we got 120,000. Not too long after that, we got payments of 80,000 until we had the 600,000 Jimmy wanted. A few years later, when Solomoni got called to a grand jury, we found out about it. Jimmy grabbed him again, and this time he and Stevie told him exactly what to say to the grand jury about the extortion. I don't know what he had actually said, but that was the end of that. Nothing ever came out of his appearance. None of these extortions were hard to put together. We did the same. We did them so often, It was second nature. We'd be driving around and see someone, and we'd formulate a plan. And I never felt bad about any of them. Uh, these people had something I wanted, so I took it. The only time I might have felt bad was if they didn't give me the money. And for money laundering, that was a mundane crime, not an exciting one. Anytime you take illegal money and put it to work for you, that's money laundering. Even if you take money gained illegally, deposit it in the bank, and put that interest to work for you in a business or a transaction, that's money laundering. For instance, Stevie bought businesses with illegal money he saved, and that was money laundering. It was just one more thing the government can get you for, as obscure as a crime as it is. While money laundering might not still be considered a big crime, to my way of thinking, it is just an attempt to put money back into the economy. All we were trying to do was help the growth of our gross national product. I call it economic stimulation. The government calls it money laundering. The truth is that this book contains some of what we did, but certainly not all. It would take another two or to three books to chronicle the other 80% of the story. But whatever Jimmy and I all and all the others did, it was always for the money, not even for the power, just the money. Well, that's it. That's chapter 4. That was an hour and 31 minutes, 38. That's a long read, man. I'm on, page 106 now. So, yeah, I really wanted to bash on and get this chapter read, so I'm pretty glad I did. It's quite an interesting book, to say the least. That about the MK Ultra, I thought that was very interesting because we all see quite a bit of videos nowadays about that, but back then obviously it was kind of like a secret. That Coca-Cola and the CIA were involved in LSD and MK Ultra. That's crazy, man. And that Jimmy was involved in it. Jimmy was also at Alcatraz, though, so the guy's a legend, man. Anyways, that's my Christmas Eve reading. Hour 32 minutes. Almost hour 33 for me. So on that note, I wish you a Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a good Christmas day. I'm going to be here with my dogs and my cat, and I'm going to be doing another reading tomorrow on Christmas Day, so I want to get this thing done. Have a good one. I'm out.